But thank you for coming this morning. The title of this session is Symptoms of a Troubled Treasury Department. I feel like the unofficial word that should be after that is whoa. Symptoms of a Troubled Treasury Department. Essentially what we're going to talk about are best practices, but we're going to start on the flip side. What are some of the worst practices that are in the marketplace, and how can we learn to notice them, and more importantly, how do we address them, and thirdly, how do we prevent them in the future? So that's what we'll cover here. This presentation is broken down into 4 distinct areas. The first is we're actually going to talk about some of the symptoms that I've seen in the marketplace as a consultant. Then we'll talk about how to actually diagnose those symptoms to help prevent them from happening in the future. I have a case study that we can talk about briefly, and then I really want at the end to go over questions and answers. So if you happen to have any questions, we'll be able to answer them that time. But please don't make that prevent you from raising your hand throughout the presentation. If you have a question on a particular bullet point, please let me know. I'd be happy to discuss it at that moment in time. So this is the potential audience reaction to this presentation. It's not a scientific survey. This is just an estimate, but if you were to look at the y-axis, that's sort of your mood, if you will, from an audience point of view, starting up high, but then we're going to talk about all these bad symptoms that happen in Treasury departments. You know, what happens when things are not working great in Treasury. So, but then I'm hoping that we're going to move slowly up towards the end of the, by the end of the presentation to where we talk about, well, okay, so there are a lot of bad symptoms that could happen within a Treasury department. How do we address them? And more importantly, how do we prevent them in the future? So when we talk about symptoms, there are really 5 main areas that I've noticed as a Treasury consultant to where worst practices, if you will, can propagate. The first is within Treasury operations. Second is within internal controls. And I'll talk about this a little bit more detail in in the next slides. But with internal controls, it's really what I found is Treasury has to do a lot with little, and that can materially affect internal controls. Disaster recovery, Treasury technology, and banking architecture. We'll go into all of these in more details in the next slides. So in regards to Treasury operations, the first thing that comes to mind are just plain inefficient processes. Processes that are not streamlined as well as they could be. Oftentimes there's an over-reliance on staff, and typically it does not involve Treasury technology. So if you have too many people addressing the same problem, if you just have a problem and the solution is, well, let's hire more people to address it, that might be a symptom of a worst practice. It's not addressing the cause, it's addressing the symptom. So we're looking at trying to get to the cause. So how do you do that? Well, you have to document all of your process. I'm a big fan of documenting your processes in 2 methods. One is in a narrative flow, a narrative format, to where you're able to see step by step what each particular process is. But in this particular situation, I think it's equally as important, maybe a little bit more important, to document them in a flowchart format, so that you can see at a very high level, what does this entire, let's say, EFT process, what does this entire EFT process look like? How many people have to be involved within our organization in order to send an ACH, for example? The idea here, especially with the flowcharts, is you just take a step back, hold the flowchart at arm's length away, and say, does this look streamlined? Does this look complicated? Or worse yet, if you're holding 2 flowcharts for an ACH, does this look streamlined and does this look complicated? And if the answer is no to streamlined and yes to complicated, then chances are there's a symptom of a worst practice somewhere in there. There's an opportunity for you and your organization to, 1, recognize that there's a worst practice, and more importantly, a opportunity for you as a practitioner to make an enhancement to it. So again, moving on to the internal controls and where some worst practices are there. Every Treasury Department I've been in, I have never seen excess capacity. They're always working at 95 to 99.999% capacity, which essentially equals do more with less. Oftentimes, internal controls may be sacrificed in situations like that, to where we don't have enough people to do all the proper checks. Therefore, we just have 2 instead of 3. Not necessarily the best approach. When it comes to Treasury operations, in my opinion, it's very important to implement efficient operations, but not at the sacrifice of internal controls. Internal controls should be the #1 priority when handling cash. Then look at the efficiency and see if you can implement that. So some of the areas where internal controls can be deficient, if you will, within the Treasury processes. I mean, there are plenty of opportunities for lack of internal controls there. Some of the ways that you can address the internal controls issues is by having a detailed audit trail of who did what when within your Treasury Department. Now, if you're running a spreadsheet shop, it's sort of hard to do that. If you're working with a Treasury workstation, there's probably more of a likelihood that you'd be able to implement a who did what when policy and internal control initiative within your organization. And regardless of the technology that you're using, having clear separation of duties, and I would also add clear separation of reporting within your Treasury Department. If you can implement that, you're taking the first right steps towards making a more secure Treasury Department, which again is priority #1, and then looking at the efficiencies. Once we have a secure operations, how do we make it as efficient as we can within that parameter? So another area where there's a symptom of a worst practice in Treasury management is disaster recovery plans. This is key. Either there are no disaster recovery plans or they're very ineffective. Now, in order to create a great disaster recovery plan, I think you really need to be able to work remotely for a set amount of time. Now, when we think of disaster, what comes to mind? Oftentimes people are thinking, well, we're not going to be able to come into the office for a month. We may need to relocate to another region. But chances are a disaster is going to be a flood in the basement of your office building or something similar to that, to where you're not going to be able to come in for a day or 2. Most disasters, if you will, fall into that category. So that's what you should plan for, in addition to the large disasters also. But the idea of disaster needs to be explored, especially the duration of which. Ever since 2008, I've also changed my definition of disaster. So what is the definition of disaster? Flood, fire, earthquake. You can't get into the office. How many here would think that lack of liquidity for Treasury professionals would be a disaster? Everyone in the room, essentially. So is there any reason why that should not be incorporated into a disaster recovery plan? What do we do if there is no liquidity? What is our backup plan? If there is no liquidity, if we do not have access to our cash in order to do cash management, Treasury management, whose responsibility will that ultimately be in that disaster? If you're a Treasury practitioner, it's you. That's all there is to it. If there's going to be a disaster in that regard, it's your responsibility. Therefore, when creating a disaster recovery plan, definitely, let's take into consideration fire. Let's take into consideration earthquake. Let's take into consideration our location and how we're able to work remotely. But please, take into consideration financial risks, liquidity risks, counterparty risks, and incorporate that into your disaster recovery plan. So oftentimes there are a few things that you take. I read that there's only a certain amount of information that people take away from presentations. Can't take away everything, only a few bullet points here and there. Please remember this one. I think it's important. Okay, another symptom of a troubled Treasury Department is on the staffing and bank relationship side. So another area that I've noticed throughout my years of consulting is inefficient workload allocation is a big key to worst practices within Treasury departments. Now what is that? Essentially that is a manager, Treasury manager for instance, who just does not want to allocate responsibility for anything. He or she feels as if everything has to be on their plate in order for Treasury to operate, which in certain instances may be the case. There are some things that the Treasury manager absolutely has to do. But in some other instances, it's not always the case. Maybe it's something the senior analyst can do, or the AT can do, or the director can do. So the idea with implementing best practices is also looking at workload allocation within your Treasury department as a whole to determine if it's optimal, to determine if one person or two people are taking on more responsibility than they should, more responsibility than they effectively can. And then too many bank relationships. So yes, there's something to be said about having a diversified bank relationship architecture, spread the counterparty risk with liquidity management and everything else. But on the other side of that spectrum is too many bank relationships to where you have higher fees, the potential duplicative services to which you're paying for, and weaker internal controls. So a simple example we'll go back to EFTs again. If you have 4 banks with 4 EFT software systems or websites, for instance, you and your Treasury department and your corporation have 4 sign-ins to EFT software or EFT platforms. Those are 4 potential internal control leaks or problems there. So it's a matter of reining in the potential for weak internal controls. So we've talked about, what are the worst practices? Where can they typically be found real quickly? So what are the risks? Why should we be looking for worst practices within Treasury? Well, quite frankly, fraud. When working in Treasury, you're working with cash. And as we all know, when cash gets sent or when checks get cashed, that money leaves. It's not a journal entry that corrects it. It's a call to the bank. It's a major issue. So with fraud, you want to make sure that you are able to help prevent to the fullest extent possible fraud both internally and externally. Higher employee turnover. If you have a Treasury department that has many worst practices, chances are your employees are not going to be as satisfied because they are doing work over and over again. They may not be working in the best conditions. They may not have high satisfaction. Therefore, they will leave. There is an additional cost to the organization when there's turnover with employees. That knowledge that they were trained with leaves out the door when they go. So you have to start all over again, which is just a downward spiral of inefficiency. There's greater Treasury operational errors when you don't automate, when you don't incorporate technology, when it's a very manual process, when the solution is let's get more people on that problem. A greater chance for operational errors. Lower inefficiency, lower strategic input. Again, since 2008, and TreaSolution's done a lot of research on this, we've seen treasurers say that their strategic input within their organization has grown exponentially. So if the leader of the Treasury department is saying that, if you are within that Treasury department, I sure hope that your strategic input is growing at a corresponding level. If not, then you need to look at your processes and see how you can afford yourself the opportunity to take a step back and look at things critically within your organization to add that strategic value. Again, higher Treasury costs. We talked about this briefly with turnover, employee turnover, banking fees, salaries, etc. And then, again, the inability to operate during a disaster in every definition, both physical form, financial form. Again, let's revisit the definition of a disaster for Treasury.